Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini, and in this video tutorial, I'm sharing with you my top 3 tips for sewing accurate 1/4 inch seam allowances. So I recently launched a 2019 online quilt club for my students, and I've had a ton of people sign up, but many of them are beginners. And this is a problem that I see all the time when I teach online and when I teach in person. So I'm gonna share with you 3 tips on sewing accurate 1/4 inch seam allowances and give you an example of a little test that you can do at home to make sure that you end up with the perfect seam allowances across all your patchwork pieces. So here's an example of a quilt block that has 24 individually cut and sewn patchwork pieces. The more pieces in a quilt block, the more consistent you need to be with accurate cutting and accurate piecing. And the reason for that is that at every seam allowance, any inconsistency in the size of the seam allowance that you're sewing will compound itself across every additional seam that you sew. So the more patchwork pieces in a block, the more off you're going to be in whatever little bit you were over or under that 1/4 inch seam allowance, okay? So I'm gonna share with you 3 tips on what I like to do for myself for accurate patchwork, like in this block, and then also what I like to teach my students, both online and in person. So when we're making our quilt blocks, we know how important it can be to make sure that you cut your pieces accurately and that you sew accurately, meaning maintaining a consistent seam allowance so that when all the little pieces of each block are sewn together, they finish at the size that it's designed to be. So an example would be a block like this that has 24 different little pieces of fabric that we sewed together to make just the one block. Well, because there are so many pieces, we have so many different seams that connect all of them together. And if I'm off by a little bit, whether it is that I'm sewing a skinnier than a 1/4 inch seam or bigger than a 1/4 inch seam allowance, whatever inconsistencies off of what you should be aiming for, which is the 1/4 inch, any difference in that is going to compound itself across every single seam. And what happens is that when the full block comes together, if you are sewing bigger than a 1/4 inch seam, you'll end up with a block that is significantly smaller than it was designed to finish. And if you're sewing a seam allowance that's way too scant, meaning narrower than that allotted for 1/4 inch, you're going to end up with a block that is bigger than it was designed to be. So this is one of the trickiest parts for beginners, is making sure that you're sewing a consistent seam allowance so that in the end it finishes at the 1/4 inch, so you end up with properly sized blocks. Now these ones, for example, because I did a good job of cutting accurately and maintaining a consistent seam allowance, you can see that I have really nice intersections where the different patchwork pieces match, and the block finishes at the 12.5 inches square that it was designed to be. So I'm going to share with you 3 things or 3 tips that I do to ensure accurate seam allowances. And the first one is ditch the 1/4 inch piecing foot. A lot of higher end machines that typically have a lot of decorative stitches will include a patchwork foot. This is what this one is called on mine. Or you might see a 1/4 inch piecing foot. Or maybe you went out and purchased a generic one for your machine separately because you think that that's going to help you get a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this is what the patchwork or 1/4 inch piecing foot looks like for my machine. Different machine makes and models might require different feet, so yours might look slightly different to this. But the idea is that the needle comes down in this center groove when it takes the straight stitches, and from that center needle position to the edge of the foot here is the 1/4 inch. Now, it is an accurate 1/4 inch from the needle to the edge, but that doesn't mean that we are going to end up with perfect 1/4 inch seam allowances. And that is why I say ditch the 1/4 inch piecing foot. I don't use these on my machine, and I don't encourage my students to use them either. So let's head over to the sewing machine to show you what I do to sew accurate 1/4 inch seam allowances. Now that the patchwork foot is in my machine, I'm going to show you how this works and how you would use it if you're using a patchwork foot. I have 2 3-inch square blocks here, and then I have another set of them because we're going to compare to see which one, this foot or the universal foot with a few modifications on the machine, which one is going to get me the more accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance in the end, okay? So this is the one that we're going to use with the presser foot. I'm going to place these 2 3-inch squares on top of each other, and I'm going to use the edge of my presser foot here as my guide. And just for reference, I'm using an 80-12 universal needle and 50 weight 100% cotton piecing thread, okay? So there is the seam that I've sewn with the patchwork foot. Now let's take it off. And I'm going to put on the regular foot, universal foot that comes on the machine. And now we're going to move the needle position on this machine over, closer to the edge of this foot. Now this machine has a button where I can press this number 3 and it will automatically jump the needle over so it sets it 1/4 of an inch from the edge. But what I recommend is that you sew, or maybe you've seen this before on patterns or online or somewhere, a scant 1/4 inch, which means just 1 or 2 threads narrower than an actual 1/4 of an inch. And after we sew it, I'm going to show you why that's important. So I'm going to have the needle in the center position, and I'm going to move the needle position over to the edge here, closer to the right, by adjusting the stitch width. Now I'm on a straight stitch setting, and there is no width, right? The needle doesn't jump left to right when it's just going straight. So what happens on a machine that allows you to adjust stitch width is that it will move the needle position over as you increase or lower the stitch width setting. So on this machine, I like to go to like a 6.4, and that just means the needle positioning, 6.4. And now I'm going to put these 2 squares together and sew it over. Now each machine is going to be slightly different, so what you'll do is cut out a couple squares like this, and of course if you have an accurate measurement, after you sew it together, you know what the finished size would be because we're going to subtract the seam allowance, and we'll move on to that in a second. But let's go ahead and stitch this scant 1/4 inch seam first. So here's the one I did with the 1/4 inch pressing foot, and here's the one that I did without. All right, so here are both options. And if I put them side by side, I can see that this one is slightly narrower than this one. And this is the chunkier one that I sewed with the 1/4 inch foot. So to check our work and make sure that we have the proper settings to sew the perfect scant 1/4 inch, we're gonna head over to the ironing board, press these guys open, and measure it across both patchwork pieces connected like this, and see which one of these 2 options actually gave us the better 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so here are our patchwork pieces, and we're going to place them on this pattern paper just so hopefully the white background will allow you to see it a little bit better. So this is the one that we sewed with the 1/4 inch, and let's just bump them up just to visually compare without taking measurements first. So if I line them up flush there, I can see that this top one is just a little bit shorter than the bottom one that I used by moving over the needle position. So now let's take some actual measurements. If each of these squares measured 3 inches by 3 inches, that means that 3 inches and another 3 inches gives us 6 inches of fabric that we started off with. Then in the seam allowance, we ate up about 1/4 of an inch from both of the squares. So when they're sewn together, we know that from here to here should measure 1/2 an inch less than what we started with. So this should measure 5.5 inches. So let's place my ruler, looks flush there, and here. So now let's have a look at see what happened. Here's my 5.5 inch line, and you can see that I am exactly 1/8 of an inch shorter than the 5.5 inches. So that tells me that my seam allowance is too big than the 1/4 inch after it's pressed over and everything. So even though we used 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you have to account for the thickness of the thread, and I'm using a 50 weight cotton. If you're using something thicker like a 40 or 30 weight thread, you're going to be eating up significantly more of the threads of the fabric, so you'll end up with an even bigger seam allowance. Then when we press the fabric open, the fabric that wraps over where the stitches are, if you don't do a really great job pressing this flat, you'll find that the fabric wants to kind of bubble over. And then what that does also is it adds more threads to it. So every step of the way, you could potentially be adding width, right, to that seam allowance. So we see this looks like a nice 1/4 of an inch, but in everything, it's kind of bigger. You know, it's kind of like exactly 1/4 of an inch, plus the width of the thread, plus the fold over of the fabric over the stitches. And we see that even though it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I end up with an 1/8 of an inch short of what I should have, okay? So that's how that works out. And I find that a lot of people have an issue with that, and they don't ever go back and check to make sure that they're ending up with a 1/4 inch. So let's see the other one. You can see by looking at it that that seam allowance is a really narrow 1/4 of an inch. Let's measure it and see. It's gonna be, yep, This tick mark here is the 1/4 inch mark, and my line doesn't reach it. So I know that my seam allowance here is even narrower than the 1/4 inch, and that's what we mean by scant. It should be skinnier just a little bit by a couple threads than the true 1/4 inch, because then we add in the width of the thread. In my case, it's pretty fine, plus the fold over of the fabric. And now let's measure this guy and see. And you'll see that it is exactly 5.5 inches, which is what we should have, okay? So those are my 3 tips for getting accurate seam allowances that are really gonna come in handy when you start making quilt blocks that have a lot of pieces in them, okay? That's when it's really more noticeable when you're off, because it compounds itself across every single seam. So tip number 1, ditch the 1/4 inch foot. Tip number 2, go ahead and put the regular presser foot on your machine and move that needle position over and measure. Do a couple of tests and jot that down so that you know at what width position on your machine you need to have it to get your perfect scant 1/4 inch. And third tip is to make a sample piece like this. You can cut out 2 3-inch squares, sew them together with a few different settings, and the one that gives you exactly the size that you should have, in our case 5.5 inches, is the setting that you want to go with each and every time you sew your patchwork blocks together. I hope you enjoyed that patchwork tip. Give it a go at home. Check your user manual, play around with both your 1/4 inch presser foot and, again, like I mentioned, changing that needle position over closer to that right side edge of the universal presser foot. And you can typically bump them over, 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, and that way you can get a really accurate gauge of the perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, especially accounting for the thickness of the thread that you like to use. So you'll have to adjust all those things accordingly, but when you find the perfect settings, make sure to jot them down so you can use it across all of your patchwork pieces. Now, if you like these types of tips and you're interested in learning more about quilting, trying out some different skills and techniques, click the link I've included for you in the description box below. You can head on over, and if you're watching this the week of May 20th, 2019, you still have several days where you can get in on the early bird sale price to join my online quilt club. After that, the quilt club will still be available. It will just be at a slightly higher rate. If you want to save some money and you want to join us for an online community of live chat videos, multiple different quilt projects, and a mystery block of the week 12-week series as a part of our online quilt club, click the link below, and I hope to see you in class. Thanks again for watching. Click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on my future videos, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.